AI, frankly, from my point of view, has been used to speed things up, take out risk, or brief example is just even sort of looking at responses to a public consultation and being able to get a very quick initial snapshot, not to replace a human review, but to get the first cut, so to speak. But we're probably not even scratching the surface yet.
Hi, I'm Belden Menkus. Welcome to the Purposeful Strategist, the podcast that shifts the conversation about purpose and strategy from what organizations should do to what business leaders are doing and what they've learned along the way.
My guest today is Fiona Dunsire, the Government Actuary and head of the Government Actuary's Department, or GAD, an organization that provides actuarial analysis and advice across the UK public sector. GAD's work spans everything from pensions and health to climate risk and disaster financing, helping government departments make informed, evidence-based decisions. Fiona took on the role in 2023, becoming the first woman to hold the position since it was established in 1917. She brings deep expertise from her 25 years at Mercer, 7 of which as UK CEO. Now at the helm of GAD, she's leading the organization into its next strategic chapter. Fiona, welcome to the Purposeful Strategist.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, Belden.
I wonder if we could start just by asking you to tell us a bit about what drew you to join the Government Actuaries Department after more than 3 decades in the private sector. And what was that transition like for you, both personally and professionally?
Sure. So, as you mentioned, I'd had 35 years at Mercer. I'd worked as a consultant, primarily advising on investments for institutional investors. And I'd had a large leadership role as the UK CEO and a global leadership role across Asia, Middle East, Africa, and LATAM. So I'd had, if I'm honest, a fantastic career in joining that sort of organisation. I joined it as a graduate straight from university, and therefore had never actually worked anywhere else, albeit I had a wide range of roles there. I left Mercer and wasn't really sure what I was going to do next. Was thinking maybe a non-exec role. And when I was contacted about the government actuary role, it's interesting, my immediate reaction was, actually, that's a job I'm very interested in. I saw the opportunity to really have an impact, I hope, on some of the big issues that we face as society. Demographic change, the impact of an aging population, climate change, how we deal with the challenges of funding and the value of health and social care, etc. All felt like things that would be in my responsibility or have an opportunity for. So I was immediately attracted by that sort of purposeful societal sort of impact in the work. I also applied to GAD when I left university as a graduate, and I indeed got a job offer from GAD at that time, but chose the role at Mercer over GAD. So I have to say, in many ways, whilst the people who contact me about it would never have known that, it's also a humongous privilege to get the opportunity to almost do a full circle of what would it have been like if I had joined. So I guess that sort of signals that I'd already had an element in my thinking where GAD featured in the industry.
You mentioned a number of very big problems, climate, et cetera, et cetera. Do you see GAD being able to play a role helping government broadly understand how these issues connect together? Or do you often end up finding that somebody's got a reasonably narrow question and your ability to kind of get outside that is a bit limited?
The short answer to that is probably a bit of both, in that certainly I see our opportunity as being how can we bring the breadth of skills across a group of actuaries, and not just actuaries actually, in terms of GAD and the diverse work that we do across government to help on those sort of serious systems challenges and systemic issues. And we'll talk a bit in due course, I'm sure, about looking at our strategy. But I would also say that partly because of the way government works, partly because of the way we have worked, it may sometimes be the case that we are supporting what has then already been narrowed as a problem. I certainly want our role in government to be a sort of a partner, a go-to department where people can get us involved early as they're starting to think about the problem so that we can help to frame it, even if we're not the only people involved in helping to solve it. I'm conscious you also asked me about what was the transition like. I would say that probably like many people who had worked their career in the private sector, I probably had only a very narrow understanding of how government works. I found many elements of the transition personally to be actually much easier than I expected. One of my worries was, would I fit? I have a fairly open and direct style, and I probably had a misunderstanding of what the culture at GAD would be like. And actually, from day one, found that the personal side of things was much easier than I thought it would be. Having said that, I came from an environment where I had worked there all my life, so building new relationships and understanding some of those relationships certainly is something that needed more effort. And even that whole thing of who do you trust with certain different types of problems, because different people bring different skills to things. How do you make sure people will give you honest opinions when they don't yet know you as a leader and an individual? And you have to have that. I mean, particularly when you talk about the professional aspect of it, from day one, you're professionally responsible for the overall output. So making sure that people can feel that they can be honest with you, dig in more on the numbers or whatever it may be, is really important. But I realized that I would have to work harder to make sure I could get to know people quicker as a result.
I guess I could also imagine, having been at Mercer as long as you were sort of in some senses known to everyone.
Yeah.
Even if they'd never met you, you were kind of known to them, whereas you didn't have that.
I mean, I used to say my superpower was how to get things done around here, sort of thing. So,
Yeah.
whilst it wouldn't mean that everyone knew me, it's a very large multinational. Yes, you knew the routes to go, and if on a tricky problem, you knew who to phone up in Canada to ask, and they would answer their phone or whatever, or their email, etc.
Very interesting. And were there any specific things you brought with you from the private sector that you'd say has sort of influenced how you've been leading and enacting the role you've got within GAD?
I think when I took on the role, it was made clear to me that the role is a combination of a CEO type leader. I am the head of the department, as well as a technical element to it as well. But the balance between those, it varies from time to time, but it's very significantly in the leader side of things. And I think where I brought experience on that was the understanding that I developed through my leadership journey at Mercer of we're always needing to develop and stretch ourselves and learn more. Nobody's fully formed as a leader. You're not born as a leader in that respect. And therefore, making sure that you're sort of constantly investing time in that and thinking about that both individually and as a leadership team, I think was something that I certainly brought in as part of my sort of working with my new leadership team here when I joined. I was probably quite lucky in that I'd had many opportunities over the years to get some of the psychometric testing to work about styles of leadership and how that plays out within a team. And I was keen there to make sure that I brought some of that into how we formed as a new leadership team, because again, I was coming in, inheriting a position that was in a good, strong position. There are no issues, but I still needed to build us. Any change to a team creates new dynamics. So I personally have always felt that the understanding of the things that make us individually sort of strengths are also, when overplayed, are derailers. And therefore what that means for a group is something that I did spend time on with my team in the first sort of 6 months so that we could actually understand how to work together well and take forward the department to the next stage.
You're the first woman to hold this role as a government actuary. And I'm kind of curious, is that a thing? Has it made a difference that you're a woman following 100 some odd years of men? Or is it like, no, we're all people? Where does that show up for you?
I don't know. I'm very proud to be the first woman government actuary. There have only been 9 government actuaries before me, so I'm the 10th and the first woman. I'm not particularly proud that it's me. I'm just very proud that we've got a woman in the role from that point of view. And I certainly am never shy to say that I am the first woman in the role. It's nothing to do with me in that role, but more that it's a sort of signal of the change and the greater role of women in leadership. And, the statistics are getting there when we look at the data, but we're still way off gender parity. So I think we have to sort of celebrate each one. Actually, if you look in particularly pensions, which is a big part of what we do, but pensions in government, there's Government Actuaries Department, and then from more of a regulatory and a safety net perspective, there's the Pensions Regulator and the Pension Protection Fund. And we actually are in the unique situation of having women at the head of all 3 of those at the moment. Keep me need to do some more with the 3 of us, or get us together a bit more. We obviously do interact, but I think there's an opportunity there we've yet to fully capitalise on.
It's funny, if you had asked me about each one of them separately, I would know that it was currently headed by a woman, but it never quite struck me until you said it, that it's all 3. That's really interesting. Do you think that's a sign of a bigger change sort of in the actuarial and pensions profession from being what I think has been historically a sort of predominantly male profession to something that's much more balanced, or even shifting around the other way?
It's probably more societal change, if I'm honest. When I joined as an actuary, I joined the profession in 1988 as a trainee. And I had a very balanced intake, and thereafter, so if you looked at the number by gender, the gender equality was pretty balanced all the way through that. The issue we have had, which is the same issue as most organisations or professions have had, is how do you retain women and put them through the leadership pipeline. So I suspect what we're seeing is actually of a generation where we're seeing that actually they had sufficient experience and the ability to come through the profession is really what's happening at the same time. I don't know that I do the role differently because, I don't think there's anything from that point of view. And I don't know that my style is because I'm a woman, but I know my style is probably more open. And maybe more relatable. I've had children, I've worked while having children, I know what it's like to try to balance your lives in that respect. Now, obviously men have children, but we all have to acknowledge it hasn't been quite the same thing, it's getting better. So from that perspective, I do hope that once you've gone through that barrier, nobody will ever have to say, we've never had a woman in the role again.
Yeah. You've recently developed the next strategy for GAD. I just wonder if you could talk us through the process for that.
Sure. So again, in some respects, I was very lucky in that the strategy process within GAD has been a 5-year process. And when I joined, it was very end of 2023. So we were just entering the last year of the current strategy. Now, when you join an organisation as a new leader, you obviously do want to review where are we, where are we heading. There was a very natural time to do that, which allowed me to spend my first 4 or 5 months properly getting to know the organisation and not needing to go too fast and feel under pressure to go too fast. Because we had a year already of the strategy still to run, but it meant that we needed to start the process at that time of where are we going next. And I think that maybe was helpful because it didn't put a particular time pressure of make changes for change's sake and allowed me to listen and understand a bit more. In terms of developing the strategy, I should say, Belden, we had help from you, for which I'm very grateful. But in setting ourselves up, I was clear the strategy was ours to own and develop. We weren't outsourcing that. I used the opportunity to get a cross-section of the department who actually had to put up their hand to apply to be part of the team to develop the strategy at different levels, and to be the arms and the legs for the executive team in pulling together the work and taking it through the stages. And that, in a way, was a luxury for me compared to how perhaps I'd had to do it in a more commercial world where your strategy's got an absolute deadline of getting the numbers into the corporate plan to get through the next set of, and so on. And I was clear about what I wanted. I wanted us to be thinking in big picture, starting with sort of as big an opportunity set and thinking about what could we be in 5 years' time, and sort of working backwards from that, rather than starting from where we were and rolling it forward, which is unlikely to get us sort of a radical options coming in. And I certainly found the role that you and your team you brought was to give us some critical challenge and challenge us on our ambition and things like that, which certainly added value through the process.
Well, thank you for that. It was a pleasure and an honor to work both with you and with the team. It'd just be interesting to hear how you might describe, particularly for somebody who might not necessarily know that much about actuarial activities and all. What was that big possibility you saw out in the future that you felt, yeah, that's sort of in the right direction? We may not know every bit about it, but that's worth going after. How would you describe that?
So I think it probably comes back to some of the things that attracted me to joining GAD in the first place, which is about how can we make sure that we are actually impacting some of the areas that we should be, so that with hindsight, when you look back, where are we behind the scenes? We're not going to be visible to the outside world, but where are we behind the scenes helping some of those big long-term financial risk decisions, and did we bring the breadth of our experience to bear on them? And so for me, it was how can we make sure we're positioning ourselves so that we're in those conversations at the right time, and partners across government see us as a partner who brings that strategic problem solving and sort of deep understanding of finance and risk and how you value long-term liability to the discussions.
Yeah, one of the big issues in that is helping the public kind of understand, well, so what really are the choices here? What really are the things that are being played off? I've got it right. This isn't GAD's role at all. But as GAD, are you able to kind of get some of those topics on the table? Or is it more, we just hope that the politicians, once they've figured out what they're doing, have a way of communicating it?
Potentially it depends in that it's not our job, and it's never your job in government to be the setter of policy. That's for the politicians.
Yeah.
And so typically I don't think it will be visible where those things are happening. There are potential opportunities for it, for example, long-term care. But if you look backwards, the various pensions commissions, from which we had radical change in the pension system and introduced auto-enrollment, did put an evidence base which allowed a sort of cross-party and societal acceptance of there needs to be change. And the change means I am going to have to pay more as an individual, and my employer is going to have to pay more in order to have more people covered by a workplace pension. So I would say that's a sort of example where you can see that societal and a more public element to it. Those are the sorts of forum where it can come out. I had much more freedom as a CEO of a US multinational to talk about what I thought in some respects than I do in this role, because that happens in a different sphere. And, some of that might be frustrating. It will be interesting to see at the end of my tenure, did I get my voice in the conversation at the right times on some big issues that are happening?
Yeah, what you're talking about there touches on another area I'd like to explore, which is, GAD's clearly had a strong emphasis on stewardship and public services. I mean, I know both from documents and from just talking to people there that it's pretty deep in everybody's bones. But do you see that evolving as you look to the future?
I certainly don't see it as weakening in any way. And that sort of culture, I suppose, is one of the things that brings people to GAD, in the sort of employee value proposition is got a very strong element about the impact that you can have in the stewardship. And a classic example is probably about half of the work we do is still in relation to the public sector pension schemes, so covering all of the, the police, the fire, the NHS, teachers, judges, armed forces, civil servants, etc. Those cover 15 million people in the UK. Now, ideally we should be doing our work for that to ensure that the analysis and the cost of those pension schemes are well recognised by government, but also deliver it as cost efficiently and quickly and get enough space to deliver what else is important. For example, lots of conversations about public sector workforce and how ensuring we've got the right levels of productivity. I'm interested in how we can link the two. We've got a really big data set across the public sector from the actuarial valuation side. Can that help us with anything about why people leave the workforce, for example, and some of those problem solving? So I think there's some linked problems in that are very clear, but I don't think any of it really, it almost couldn't be stronger, I don't think, in terms of a sort of culture.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. Certainly from my own experience. One of the things that feels like it's at least a little bit related to that question you were positing there about, can the data sets that you've got help provide insight elsewhere? Is sort of where does innovation, particularly AI, fit? Is that influencing how you work and what you focus on?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and indeed, when I first joined, I was thrilled actually both with the diversity of work we do and actually already the sort of approach to innovation and the positioning of GAD. Effectively, we are like a public sector consultancy. We charge departments for our time. Hence, we have to make sure that we're delivering absolute value for money in that. But within that, there had already been a lot of work done to put in really modern techniques, etc. And the example would be over the last 5 or 6 years, alongside hiring actuarial trainees, we've deliberately hired analysts with strong coding and increasing the AI capabilities. And we have the two side by side in our analytics team. So we definitely see that as a huge opportunity for how we could deliver, as I say, a lot of the work that we do in a more efficient way and to get more insight out of it. We've got great examples of where we've done that already, and some good examples of how AI, frankly, from my point of view, has been used to speed things up, take out risk, or brief example is just even sort of looking at responses to a public consultation and being able to get a very quick initial snapshot, not to replace a human review, but to get the sort of the first cut, so to speak. But we're probably not even scratching the surface yet.
Yeah. The aspects about AI I'm particularly interested in right now is the interplay between what I might describe as automation, using it to do things that people do and can do adequately, perhaps, but equally they're predictable enough that AI can deal with it. And what I might describe as augmentation, giving people sort of superpowers, allowing them to do things they couldn't have done before. So you don't just bring the cost of what you're doing down, you actually provide better quality, better insight, better whatever. And are you thinking about that in the way you're deploying AI? And if so, how are you managing that balance or disparity or whatever?
Yeah, and I would say the examples that have been put in practice so far are probably more in the automation area. But thinking about how we can use AI in the way you've described as augmentation has definitely got to be in scope. There are some elements in government and in public service where you have to be very aware of how you're managing the associated risks and how you can demonstrate transparency of how decisions are being taken, therefore what's happening in the sort of the inputs to that advice. I don't think that necessarily has to be a limiting factor, but it probably means that we're maybe even more aware of those issues than you might see in a pure private sector corporate in terms of how you manage that. But I certainly don't want us to limit our opportunity. It's how you then make sure you're assuring yourself of the process. It's certainly the case that as working as a civil servant, we need to be transparent and we are subject to more scrutiny than you are when you are in an equivalent role, potentially on maybe not the same size of numbers, but on at times on the similar sort of complexity of issues for a private sector client, for example. And, freedom of information requests come in all the time, and that's quite appropriate. But that does mean that you need to then be able to explain how things have been done if it's appropriate to do so in that respect.
Yeah. Well, that touches on a topic I did want to have a little bit of a look at. The GAD strategy is publicly available, and many organizations deliberately, businesses decide to publish this strategy, but many don't. Does that sort of public nature of your strategy, that degree of transparency, shape how you think about it and how you talk about it? Or is it, no, we didn't have to worry about that. We thought about it differently.
I don't think it shaped the strategy in any way, but in thinking about how we presented it, it probably made me think harder about what's useful, what needs to be in there, what actually is not that useful, not because you're trying to hide anything, but more that, a whole bunch of extra appendices that you might have seen in a corporate strategy document may not be that helpful, in fact, or a distraction. Actually, I should say we will have it all published on our website. The strategy has just gone live, and you have that sort of tipping point. So we're just in the process of updating everything to make sure that the 2030 strategy is there. I did a plan on a page, partly for internal, but actually probably more for how can we talk about this with clients, where everyone's got a single piece of paper that you can have a conversation, not on absolutely everything, but it's going to allow you to lead a conversation with clients on what we're doing and how that aligns with their needs of us, for example.
As you go out to clients with a new strategy, you're sort of trying to draw them in with you to a new future, which for some people might be a bit challenging, we weren't quite expecting that. Just interesting, what's the reaction from clients been? What have they thought, that's brilliant? And what have they thought, got to get my head around it?
Well, I mean, there's probably still a little bit of proof of the pudding on that. We're at the early stages of it.
Yeah.
I said to people early on, don't be shy, even before there's a document. This is not a secret. This is what we're doing. You can't talk about it, and use it as a tool to understand your client needs more and where they fit and what we need. So certainly my experience of speaking to clients, I've seen them really engaged. In terms of the strategy, there's two strands that are the sort of the key goals over the next 5 years. The first is making sure that we unlock value in the core work we do. And there's a large amount of work in particularly pensions and risk provisioning and a few other sort of regular statutory areas that come round on a regular cycle, either annually or maybe on a 3, 5, 4 year cycle. And they all have, in many cases, a sort of significant position on the government's balance sheet. There's sensible work that needs to be done there. However, what we want to do is deliver that work increasingly more efficiently, not because we've been lazy or stupid in the past, but because we all have the tools that we've talked about in terms of using modern coding and other techniques, for example, AI, to help fill gaps where we have to go through the same things each time on problems and so on. And I've made a public commitment around that we're trying to deliver that work in the next cycle 20 to 30% cheaper than we did last time. Now, against the background of the fiscal environment that we're in, the challenges our clients, who are typically government departments, are under. They're obviously delighted to hear that. It doesn't mean everyone's getting a fee cut or anything, because in some cases, we need to work together on what does that look like. But what we would like to do is to be able to spend that money ideally on solving other problems for them that they want us to get to, as well as the sort of the core work. And in that respect, having more impact on more policy areas across government is the second strand of the goal. And in my conversations with clients, they've seen that role of us as a partner for them as something they really do want to engage with. And it allows them to say, okay, well, how can we ask you to get involved in some of those areas earlier that we've got in our thinking? And therefore, making sure that we're actually understanding where they're heading and helping to build and support that. So I think so far we're seeing a very positive reaction.
It does seem it's something that plays across lots of organizations. You're bringing forward something different. You want to engage with your clients on a different set of issues. And even if they're eager to engage with you, you're both sort of trying to figure out something new. How have you dealt with figuring out who and how to engage in those conversations with them? Have you change the way you engage with clients, or are you sort of figuring it'll all just happen anyway?
No, I think we have been quite purposeful, in particular saying, well, that won't happen if we just do everything the way we did before. Not least because people are busy, and therefore you do need to make space to have different sorts of conversations and to engage sometimes at a different time or a different place. Normally you are going through your relationships, but in many cases you need to actually use your existing relationship to say, who are the other people in your organization or your department that actually, want the other stuff. You want the stuff we're doing, and it's great if we can do it cheaper, faster.
Yeah.
But actually, there are other things. And so we have very specifically realigned our internal structure. It shouldn't make a difference to how we face clients, but to make sure we've got people with more specific time and roles to understand what the problems we should be solving are, and make sure that we're the right people to do so. Because again, we've got a duty to deliver value for money. If somebody else in government could do it cheaper, then that's fine. The interesting thing that's a difference than coming from a very commercial organisation is our job is to not make a profit. We have to try and hit a zero each year. So we should only be doing something if it's genuinely us that should be doing it, and that it is going to sort of add value at the prices that we are charging for that. Those are commercial skills in terms of go-to-market, thinking about your USP, thinking about your target market, all of those things. Those are the discussions we're absolutely actively having. But in order to meet problems that are either now or emerging in the next few years. A final point to make probably is, even within all of that, none of us are able to just take a completely sort of blue sky approach to it, because it still has to be aligned with what are the government priorities, where do they want us to spend time, how do we make sure it's aligned with the missions and the key areas of delivering against policy. I tend to think that what we do doesn't really get challenged, and I don't mean we're not questioned on it. What I mean is it does feel very well aligned always, but that probably stops you from going a little bit too into let's create a new blue sky ourselves. You still need to ground it into the policy agenda.
Yeah, for me anyway, there's a real nugget in there, which is whether it's a commercial business or what you're doing, many organizations, I think, do have a sense of how the world could be better. And they want to move in that direction. For many of them, they want to move in that direction while making money. I've got no problem with that. I suspect you don't either. But often I think they underestimate the degree to which you need people who can sort of sell the potential, sell the possibilities, sell the purpose, and sell in a sense of bringing it alive for people, helping people realize it's possible. I think it's great that you're in what could be seen as a very uncommercial organization, being able to bring that bit of edge or whatever into it. I think it's really just fantastic. I think it's a great role model for lots of places.
And I hope we should be able to do so whilst maintaining the culture of public service and the employee value proposition. I think that's an interesting point to bring out, which I hope I will be able to look back and say, yes, we have had a go at that and been successful.
Yeah. Any advice you might give to other leaders who are grappling with their own organizations, kind of purpose and strategy and culture, and how do we fit it all together?
Oh, I'm never very good at thinking that I know the answers to any of these things or the advice. I mean, obviously, the sort of classic things about how you ask good questions and how you understand your environment around you and how you get enough diversity and challenge into a process. But probably if anyone's in a leadership role, they already know those things. So the one thing I certainly see in my own experience is I'm very comfortable with change. I like a diverse sort of environment and working on different things. And I did have that experience in 35 years with the same firm. Otherwise, I wouldn't have stayed there. But I do also see the benefit of change from an organisational point of view, and therefore sort of bringing a different lens has got a good value. One of the reasons I joined GAD was to test, can I lead in a different environment? What's it going to feel like? Again, my leadership thing is some change is probably healthy, and maybe in my case was overdue in forcing myself to think slightly differently.
Yeah. Anything we haven't touched on you'd like listeners to know?
I think Well, we've touched on it, but probably a little bit of a debunking of what it's like to work in the public sector, and that probably all the expectations I had were wrong in many cases. There's others that I've maybe seen and been frustrated by. It's not saying everything's perfect in any organisation from that point of view. I suppose the other is talked a little bit about how you and I first met was a conversation around culture and purpose, where I was commenting that I didn't feel like everybody wants to make sure they've got clear purpose in their organisation, but I didn't feel that that could trump culture. And certainly, I think so far in my time here, where purpose is clearer and more obvious to everyone in GAD than I think it is as easily in a private sector organisation, I still see culture as so important as the enabler to actually get things done and to see that work.
Yeah, my experience perhaps matches yours, is that if you do have a clear purpose, without it being dogmatic, I think there is sometimes can sort of almost get too clear. There's only one truth, one version, one way. But if you don't get to that, I think often it allows a very healthy culture to grow, and that positive culture helps drive the purpose forward. You get into a very good reinforcing cycle, almost no matter what kind of organization it is. People like to accomplish stuff. People like to be part of a group of people who are doing something good.
Yeah, exactly. And that's maybe my final interesting point. If you said to me, what would success look like in 5 years' time? If I'd been sitting in the private sector, I would be talking about what we've done. I definitely would want it to be about the impact. But I would also have some, like, we're going to be bigger, we'll have grown our profits and all of those. Actually, that's where you get quite challenged here, because we could be bigger if we're solving more problems and we genuinely need more people to do so, then we could be bigger. If we can actually solve more problems by doing things quicker and using those people in the right ways and using our machines and other things in the right way, then maybe we shouldn't be. And so it actually makes for a leadership issue when you're looking at your metrics. I want to see significant efficiency savings. And normally you would see that because it would come through in your margin. But we don't have a margin. I hadn't realized how hard it was going to be to think about how do I demonstrate that we've actually been successful on things that I just sort of taken for granted. That's probably been my more recent understanding of what the difference is in moving from the private to the public sector in terms of how you're measuring success.
That's really interesting. If I could just share one other thought with you and with the listeners. One of the things I've always experienced whenever you and I have spoken is you have an inherent sort of almost like joy of what's in front of you and the things you're dealing with. As a leader, that must be an incredibly sort of infectious and almost sort of a superpower. Just sort of being able to bring a sense of happiness and possibility to it, I think is really great, a real great strength.
I would say I've made a career out of taking forward other people's good ideas. And if you can get the good ideas out of people, that's a much better way of doing things. So, yeah.
I wouldn't mind having an opportunity in a few years to sort of hear how it's all gone.
Well, we'll see, yes.
It'd be great to have you back.
Great. Thanks very much, Belden.
Thank you. Bye now.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of The Purposeful Strategist. In addition to being available on our website, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do follow us and leave us a 5-star review. It helps others find the podcast. Thanks again, and join us soon for the next episode of The Purposeful Strategist.